Your future isn't something you're moving towards. It's something you're remembering. Everything you've been taught about manifestation was built on the wrong premise. Just think about it. Think about every single technique that you've used. The vision boards, the scripting, all the gratitude practices, all those times where you visualized and you held the image of your future life with everything you had, and then you opened your eyes and you were still the same person. You see, this is not a discipline or a belief problem. This is a premise problem. You were given a construction blueprint for a future that doesn't get built. You don't build your future, you collapse into it. And until you understand the difference, you can visualize for years and still remain exactly where you are. You see, every manifestation teacher gives you the same framework. And so I want to draw two lines here. Okay. The manifestation teachers are telling you to raise your vibration, set your goals, visualize the outcome, to work hard enough, long enough, to where eventually the future arrives. This is the construction model. And what's interesting about this here is that this model treats the future like a building that you're constructing, just like if you were actually building like a residential property or a commercial one. So it's about building something that is going to eventually lead to your future. Now, here's what this model gets wrong, because here's the thing. The future is not in front of you waiting to be built. It already exists on a parallel timeline, and it's occupied by a version of you who's already become the identity that belongs to it. You see, nobody teaches you that your job is not to construct the future. So let me write this down here. This is the collapse model. And so you're not trying to build and physically construct or just construct as a whole your future. Your job is to remember the version of you that already lives there and align with them until the gap between the timelines collapse. And this is what I call the identity alchemy. Okay? And it's not some sort of visualization or positive thoughts, thinking positive thoughts, or just raising your frequency, all this stuff. This is a real precise way to actually step into the timeline, to the version of you that you actually want to become. And through my experiences of working with business owners, entrepreneurs, founders, creators, I found that a lot of them have been doing all the right stuff, but still not getting the results that they wanted. And every time I would work with them, I kept seeing this pattern. And the pattern that I kept noticing was that they were visualizing the destination while simultaneously inhabiting the identity of someone uncertain that they would actually arrive, which means that their nervous system was broadcasting two completely different signals at the same time. And their reality, which doesn't respond to what they want because it responds to who you are. It kept returning to them their current identity and not their actual vision. When I mapped this pattern out across myself and across dozens of others that I've worked with, three things became crystal clear. There are three layers to alchemical manifestation. And when all three align, the timeline doesn't gradually arrive. It collapses. The alchemist method that I'm going to walk you through today is the exact system that I've built from this pattern. So here's exactly what we're covering today. So we're going to cover the three layers of alchemical manifestation. This is where you have the identity, then a memory, and then timeline. And why all three of these must be active simultaneously in order for a timeline to collapse. And then the future memory. This is where your brain cannot distinguish between a vividly remembered past and remembered future, and how to use that mechanism, or this mechanism here, to pull a new timeline into your nervous system. This is huge. And then finally, we'll walk through the 5-step alchemist method. This is the exact sequence that moves you from your current identity to the one that belongs in the timeline that you're reaching for. And to make this real, I want to walk through an archetype that I call the visionary with no fire. This is someone who has been visualizing the same outcome for many years, but nothing has arrived. We're going to walk through what exactly is missing and what changes when we connect it all together. You're not manifesting the future. You are remembering it into existence. The version of you that's already arrived is waiting for you to remember them. Let's collapse the gap. Okay, so let me show you this through the archetype that I call the visionary with no fire. This is a person who has the full vision. They can see the house, the business, the money, the relationships, the body, the full version of themselves. They script it, they visualize it, they practice gratitude, they feel into the desired reality. But year after year, nothing lands. They're able to visualize a very specific outcome. Think about this. So like a business, for example, that they have been visualizing for so long, and they know exactly what it looks like down to the details, super specific, but nothing is able to collapse into form. And unfortunately, they're often felt with not knowing what they're doing wrong, because they thought that just having the vision and having the very specific details and feeling all the emotions and thinking positive thoughts was going to get them what they were looking for. And they just don't know how to fix this problem of doing all this stuff in terms of the visualization. And I like to look at this from like more of a feminine aspect, where you have the feminine on the left side and you have the masculine on the right side. Most of the law of attraction and manifestation content is centered around the feminine aspect, where you have the visualizations, you have the imagination, you have the feelings, the thoughts, the vision board, all of that, which is super important. But they're often missing the masculine, which is the actual way for them to manifest it in the physical external reality. You can't have one without the other. If you're just taking a bunch of action on the masculine side, then you're going to do a bunch of stuff and busy work because you're not going to have clarity in terms of what you want. But if you're just visualizing, where I see most of this problem, people just visualizing, imagining, feeling it, seeing it, super specific with it, but no action. And I think for the most part, most of these people that are going through this in terms of like the archetype of the visionary with no fire, for the most part, they know deep down really what is the issue here. Like they know that they are not taking action to bring all that into reality, but they just don't know how to fix it, because it's not as simple as just saying, hey, take action. There's a lot that needs to get worked through before you can get to that action stage. One of the biggest challenges here for these types of individuals that know what they want, can envision it, and are super clear about it is that their nervous system is out of whack, in the sense of the nervous system is set up and is running for their current identity. And so when they want to take action for something that will bring them to their future identity, to collapse the timeline, to step into some other version that is in the future, the nervous system is going to always act towards what is familiar. So if something is new outside of the current box that they're aware of, then they're going to naturally feel scared, uncertain, uneasy, right? Because it's not doing something that is familiar. It's trying to step outside of the box. However, oftentimes it's just about understanding what's really going on there in terms of the nervous system so that we can program that to accept the next version of ourselves and take action anyways. And the way that I want you to think about this is that visualization creates a glimpse of the future, and alchemy makes you the person that lives there. And that distinction is everything. Simply visualizing and getting a glimpse of that is not going to change your identity. An identity, not your desire, not your frequency, not your visualizations, is what determines which timeline you occupy. Most people who are at this stage, when they close their vision board and walk back into their day, they are unfortunately stuck in an identity loop that says, I'm someone who's still trying to figure it out. If this is actually going to work, they're visualizing the destination and inhabiting the identity of someone uncertain that they'd ever arrive. This is not a technique problem. This is an identity problem. And you don't solve this with more visualizations. You solve it with alchemy. Let me show you what that means. Let me give you the structural definition of this, because this is the foundation of everything else that follows. So let me erase this here so we can walk through the alchemy and we can break this down. So the alchemical manifestation equals identity transmutation plus emotional encoding plus future memory activation. You see, alchemy in the original sense was not about turning lead into gold. That was just a metaphor. The actual practice of this is where you're transmuting and you're turning fear into clarity, doubt into certainty, old identity into new identity, and limitation to expansion. And here's the thing, you are the raw material and your future self is the gold. Alchemy is the process of transmutation and it operates across 3 layers. Let's go over each one. Layer number 1, identity. Let me go ahead and circle this. You see, identity dictates everything downstream, what you allow into your experience, what you attract without effort, and what feels safe to reach for, and what feels so far outside of your self-concept that you unconsciously sabotage it in the moment that it gets close. Here's the thing, you're always manifesting from identity and not from desire or anything else, because desire is what you want and identity is what you allow. And the mind, every single time, will always prioritize the boundary of identity over the pull of desire. You see, identity is the operating system, and desire is just an application running on top of it. And when you change the software without updating the actual operating system, then the system keeps defaulting to its latest version, which brings us to our second layer, layer number 2, memory. You see, your brain is using your memory to predict the future. And this is not metaphysical, this is actually neurological. Every future scenario that your mind constructs is built from a library of past experiences, emotional states, and identity conclusions, which means that if your memory library is built on scarcity, then you're going to naturally predict scarcity. If it's built on fear, then it predicts threat. If it's built on statements like, people like me don't get things like that, you then predict that exact ceiling and you behave accordingly. You see, your past doesn't shape you. Your memory of the past does. And the distinction is very critical because The events are fixed, and the interpretations of those events, the conclusions they installed, the identity they constructed, those are the variable, and those are what the alchemy works on. Okay, so let's go to number 3 here. Put a 2 here, layer 3. Timeline. You see, every single desired outcome and reality that you want exists on a timeline, not just metaphorically. Think of it structurally. The future is not a single track that you're racing down toward one fixed destination. It's a field of possible timelines, each one corresponding to a specific identity, a specific emotional frequency, a specific set of behaviors and beliefs. You don't access a different timeline by running faster. You access it by switching tracks, by becoming the identity that belongs to that timeline, which means that the timeline is already there. The version of you that lives there already exists. Your current distance from that timeline is not a function of time or effort. It's a function of identity gap. And how you close this gap is by activating your future memory activation. Because the future memory is not visualization. It's not imagination. It's this. So let me bring this shorter here. So it's about accessing the emotional state, identity posture, and behavioral defaults of the version of you who has already collapsed into that timeline. So this is how you are able to cover this gap of being able to actually reach your desired reality and to collapse that timeline so that you are remembering your future, which is exactly what you want, right? Think about this. An alchemist doesn't just sit in a room and hope and wish and pray that the future arrives. They remember the version of themselves that has already lived it and aligned with that version so precisely that the gap between timelines collapsed. You see, your future self is real. You just haven't aligned with them yet. And here's exactly how you do that. Okay, so let's walk through the alchemist method. It's 5 steps, and each one closes a layer of the identity gap. Let's go over each one. So let me go ahead and erase the board here. Okay, so the alchemist method. Step 1, you want to detach. You see, you cannot step into a new timeline while the old identity is actively anchoring you to the current one. This is super important because detachment is not abandonment. You're not pretending that the past never happened. What detachment really means here is that you stop referencing who you've been as evidence of who you are. Every time that you say, I struggle with this, you anchor yourself to that timeline that struggle belongs to. Every time you reference past failure as a prediction of future probability, you file the old identity as current. Every time you allow a memory of who you used to be to define the ceiling of what you're allowed to have, you reinforce that gap instead of closing it. Detachment is the deliberate act of dereferencing the old self. Here's a question that you want to ask yourself. What identity am I referencing when I think about this outcome? So what identity am I referencing when I actually think about this outcome? And if the answer to this question is the version of you that hasn't achieved it, you need to detach from that reference point, because that identity belongs to a timeline that you are in the process of leaving. And for the visionary with no fire archetype, the identity that they are often unknowingly anchored to is someone who doesn't know if this is going to work. Every visualization session is being conducted from inside that identity, which is why these sessions feel real, but the day-to-day was unchanged. You see, the visualization technique allows you to access that future image, but the identity was filing it as a distant possibility rather than an incoming reality. Detachment for the visionary with no fire means stopping the narrating from the old self. When you catch yourself referencing who you've been, stop the sentence mid-thought, because that's not your timeline anymore. You cannot enter a new timeline while carrying the old identity as luggage. Step number 2, you want to decode. Detachment creates space, and decoding fills it in with precision. So you want to ask yourself 4 questions here. What does the future version of me believe? Specifically. Number 2, how do they feel on an ordinary Tuesday? Number 3, what do they no longer tolerate? And what do they no longer need? And then number 4, what identity have they permanently left behind? You see, decoding is not visualizing an outcome. Decoding is essentially the process of mapping out an identity, the outcome of the business, the lifestyle, the relationship. All of that is the evidence of the identity. So the identity is the actual thing that you're decoding. Most people try to manifest the evidence. The alchemist maps the identity and lets the evidence follow. If you want to decode who the future version of you is, don't start with what they have. Start with how they think, because the thought architecture came first. Everything else is downstream. And so as you're going through this exercise and you want to decode the identity here, make sure that you're asking yourself these 4 questions so that you are familiar with how your identity is actually mapped out, so that you can map it out to exactly how you want it to be, right? This is the ability for us to look at, okay, where are we at now? What does the future version of me believe? How do they feel on a regular day? What do they no longer tolerate? And what do they no longer need? And what identity have they permanently left behind? Which is going to be your old identity. The one that doesn't need to figure it out, doesn't need permission, doesn't need to second guess themselves, and actually moves and takes action towards their desired outcome. Okay, so let's go to step number 3, download. And this is the step here that separates alchemical manifestation from visualization. Because with visualization, that shows you the future. And when you download it, it actually allows you to step into that emotionally, somatically, at the level of the identity before the physical evidence arrives. You are pulling data from a future timeline into the present nervous system. You're not imagining, you're not hoping, you are remembering with the same emotional specificity and nervous system certainty that you remember a vivid experience from your past. Here's the thing. Your nervous system cannot distinguish between a memory that it has physically lived and a memory it has neurologically encoded with sufficient emotional detail. This is neurologically documented. You see, the body responds to both as real. The download is the deliberate encoding at the identity and emotional level until the nervous system accepts it as a reference point rather than aspiration. Here are the 3 download anchors. Number 1, emotional baseline. How do they feel normally? And this is why, and I talk about this in a lot of different videos, this is why I believe it's super important that you have a natural standard mental positive attitude. Okay? Where your baseline is like this. Okay? Up and down a little bit, normal. Almost like you're alive, right? You think about when you're in a hospital, and I can't quite remember what that machine is, that kind of looks at your frequency and essentially tells you that you're alive, okay? Because unfortunately, most people are like this. Super high, super low, super high, super low, okay? So you want to get to emotional baseline where you're very steady, okay? Even keel. So how do they feel normally? Not momentarily. Because you can feel positive, right? In any given moment, but can you sustain a positive mental attitude, okay? And not get too high, not get too low. And then identity posture. How do they carry themselves when no one is watching? Powerful here. This one is massive, because this is something where no matter what people are seeing in terms of when you're out there in the external world, that's one version of you. But how does this identity, how does this particular individual that's in this other timeline that you want to be in, how do they carry themselves? And the big thing here is when no one is watching, because this is the most important part here, right? You can put on a show, you can, portray yourself in a certain way in front of other people, and, do this, do that to make it look like you're somebody else. But when the doors are closed, when nobody's watching, what does that look like? Then finally here, the internal narrative. What do they say to themselves? Automatically. Do they have empowering type of language, thoughts, stories that they're consistently telling themselves, which trains their mind to get more of that, right? More positive thoughts, perspectives, stories, narratives, in terms of, I will figure this out. It is what it is. This is just a small little bump in the road. We're going to get through this. So this is the constant narrative, the story, and the different stories that they're telling themselves consistently. And all of these here are extremely important for you to realize and understand that if you truly want to reach a new timeline, a new version of yourself, you need to go through these steps here to really figure out what that future version of you is doing. How are they acting? How are they feeling? How are they seeing everything around them, so that you can literally embody that and step into it. Okay, so let's go to step number 4. Embody. Embodiment is where the future memory becomes the present self, because the nervous system requires behavioral confirmation. You can download the future identity at the emotional level, but until the behavior matches, your mind doesn't fully complete the loop. It's saying that we're practicing this but we haven't yet filed this as real yet. And with embodiment, this closes the gap. You want to ask yourself, what would the future version of me do right now that the current version is hesitating to do? Very, very powerful question here. What would the future version of me do right now that the current version is hesitating to do? And this doesn't need to be a grand, huge gesture or a massive, complete overhaul. It's just one decision, one response, one move that the person who has already collapsed into that timeline would make automatically because it matches who they are. The future identity is built one embodied choice at a time. Every choice has a vote. Every vote tells your nervous system, this is who we are, not who we are becoming. And a simple example of this with the visionary with no fire is, let's say they have like a business course or a program, a coaching program, and they decide to change the price from let's say 5K to 10K. And they do this because the future version of themselves is someone who would be charging 10K for that level of service or for that quality of a program. And so then that old price of 5K belongs to that old identity. And then you realize that the only person that had a problem with changing the price, upgrading that price to 10K from 5K was the old version of you who didn't believe or wasn't sure that you actually were worth it. You see, embodiment is not performing the future. It's deciding in the moment that the future identity is already your operating system. Okay, so let's go to the final step here. Collapse. Now, everything before this step here was preparation. When you detach, this releases the anchor of the old identity. And when you decode, you're mapping the identity that belongs to the new one. And when you download, you're encoding the future memory to the nervous system. And when you embody, you confirm the identity through behavior. And the collapse is when all 4 layers synchronize. This is where you have the identity plus emotion plus memory plus action equals timeline collapse. Okay? That's the formula. This is not something that you force. This is something that you allow by removing every internal variable that was maintaining the gap. The timeline doesn't need to be constructed. It was always there, already formed, already complete. The collapse happens when the distance between your current identity and the identity of the version of you that lives there becomes 0. Think about it this way. A radio signal is always broadcasting. The frequency was always there. You don't create the station. You tune into it. And the moment that your internal frequency matches, the signal comes through. And as you go through this process, you won't necessarily have a dramatic moment of collapse. You'll notice one day that you stop talking about it like it's a vision and start talking about it like it's happening. You'll start getting opportunities come your way that are aligned. And the interesting thing about this is that none of this will feel like a surprise. It'll feel like something that you're remembering. That's the collapse. You are not manifesting the future. You are remembering it into existence. Detach from the identity that belongs to the old timeline. Decode the version of you who already lives in that new one. Download the future memory until your nervous system accepts it as real. Embody the identity through your decisions, starting now, and collapse into the timeline that was always yours. Here's what I need you to understand. The future you is not waiting to be built. It already exists. Your job is not to create them. Your job is to remember them so precisely, so completely that your current identity and their identity become the same thing. And the moment the gap closes, the timeline collapses. The alchemist's power was never supernatural. It was simply this: they remembered the future more vividly than the past, and reality bent to the identity they chose to embody.